Understand the different types of inflation. At its most basic level, inflation is a general increase in prices across the economy and is well known to all of us. After all, who among us has not reminisced about cheap rents of the past or how little lunch used to cost? And who has not noticed prices on everything from milk to movie tickets creeping upward? In this article, we explore the major types of inflation and touch upon the competing explanations offered by different economic schools. Key takeaways. Inflation is the rate at which the overall level of prices for various goods and services in an economy rises over a period of time. As a result, money loses value because it no longer buys as much as it did in previous times. The purchasing power of a country's currency declines. Central banks look to maintain mild inflation of as much as 3 to help spur economic growth. But inflation considerably beyond that level could lead to brutal situations such as hyperinflation or stagflation. Hyperinflation is a period of fast rising inflation. Stagflation is a period of spiking inflation plus slow economic growth and high unemployment. Deflation is when prices drop significantly due to too large a money supply or a slump in consumer spending. Lower costs mean companies earn less and may institute layoffs. Stagflation and hyperinflation, two extremes. Although as consumers we may hate rising prices, many economists believe a moderate degree of inflation is healthy for a nation's economy. Typically, central banks aim to maintain inflation around 2 to 3. 1. Increases in inflation significantly beyond this range can lead to fears of possible hyperinflation, a devastating scenario in which inflation rises rapidly out of control. There have been several notable instances of hyperinflation throughout history. The most famous example is Germany during the early 1920s, when inflation reached 30,000 per month. Zimbabwe offers an even more extreme example. According to research by Steve H. Hankey and Alex K. F. Kwok, monthly price increases in Zimbabwe reached an estimated $79.6 billion in November 2008. 2. Stagflation, a time of economic stagnation combined with inflation, can also wreak havoc. This type of inflation is a witch's brew of economic adversity, combining poor economic growth, high unemployment, and severe inflation all in one. Although recorded instances of stagflation are rare, the phenomenon occurred as recently as the 1970s, when it gripped the United States and the United Kingdom, much to the dismay of both nations' central banks. 3. 4. Stagflation poses a particularly daunting challenge to central banks, because it increases the risks associated with fiscal and monetary policy responses. Whereas central banks can usually raise interest rates to combat high inflation, doing so in a period of stagflation could risk further increasing unemployment. Conversely, central banks are limited in their ability to decrease interest rates in times of stagflation, because doing so could cause inflation to rise even further. As such, stagflation acts as a kind of checkmate against central banks, leaving them with no moves left to make. Stagflation is arguably the most difficult type of inflation to manage. Negative inflation. Also known as deflation, negative inflation occurs when prices drop for various reasons. Having a smaller money supply increases the value of money, which in turn decreases prices. A reduction in demand, either because there is too large of a supply or a reduction in consumer spending, can also cause negative inflation. Deflation may seem like a good thing because it reduces the prices of goods and services, thus making them more affordable, but it can negatively affect the economy in the long run. When businesses make less money on their products, they are forced to cut costs, which often means laying off or terminating employees, thereby increasing unemployment. What causes inflation? We can define inflation with relative ease, but the question of what causes inflation is significantly more complex. Although numerous theories exist, arguably the two most influential schools of thought on inflation are those of Keynesian and monetarist economics. Keynesian economists argue inflation results from economic pressures such as the increased cost of production and look to government intervention as a solution. Monetarist economists believe inflation stems from the expansion of the money supply and that central banks should maintain stable growth for the money supply in line with GDP. Keynesian economics. The Keynesian school of thought derived its name and intellectual foundation from British economist John Maynard Keynes, 1883-1946. 5. Although its modern interpretation continues to evolve, Keynesian economics is broadly characterized by its emphasis on aggregate demand as the prime mover of economic development. As such, adherents of this tradition advocate government intervention through fiscal and monetary policy as a means of achieving desired economic outcomes, such as increasing employment or dampening the volatility of the business cycle. The Keynesian school believes inflation results from economic pressures such as rising costs of production or increases in aggregate demand. Specifically, they distinguish between two broad types of inflation: cost, push inflation, and demand, pull inflation. Cost, push inflation results from general increases in the costs of the factors of production. These factors, which include capital, land, labor, and entrepreneurship, are the necessary inputs required to produce goods and services. When the cost of these factors rise, producers wishing to retain their profit margins must increase the price of their goods and services. When these production costs rise on an economy-wide level, it can lead to increased consumer prices throughout the whole economy, as producers pass on their increased costs to consumers. Consumer prices, in effect, are thus pushed up by production costs. Demand. Pull inflation results from an excess of aggregate demand relative to aggregate supply. For example, consider a popular product where demand for the product outstrips supply. The price of the product would increase. The theory in demand. Pull inflation is if aggregate demand exceeds aggregate supply. Prices will increase economy-wide. Monetarist economic. Monetarism is not explicitly linked to a particular founding figure, but is closely associated with the American economist, Milton Friedman, 1912-2006. 6. As its name suggests, monetarism is concerned principally with the role of money in influencing economic developments. Specifically, it is concerned with the economic effects of changes to the money supply. Adherents of the monetarist school are more skeptical than their Keynesian counterparts regarding the effectiveness of government intervention in the economy. Monetarists caution such interventions risk doing more harm than good. Perhaps the most famous such criticism was made by Friedman himself in his influential publication, co-written with Anna J. Schwartz, A Monetary History of the United States, 1867-1960, in which Friedman and Schwartz argued that policy decisions of the Federal Reserve inadvertently deepened the severity of the Great Depression. 7. Based on this skepticism, Friedman suggested central banks should concern themselves with maintaining a stable rate of growth for the nation's money supply in line with the gross domestic product, GDP. 8. Monetarists. It's all about the money. Monetarists have historically explained inflation as a consequence of an expanding money supply. The monetarist view is perfectly encapsulated by Friedman's remark that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. According to this view, the principal factor underlying inflation has little to do with things like labor, materials costs, or consumer demand. Instead, it is all about the supply of money. 9. At the heart of this perspective is the quantity theory of money, which posits the relationship between the money supply and inflation is governed by the relationship. Where? The money supply. The velocity of money. The average price level. The volume of transactions. MF. Where? Mathy, money supply. Vit, the velocity of money. P, average price level. The volume of transactions. Implicit in this equation is the belief that if the velocity of money and the volume of transactions is constant, an increase or decrease in the supply of money will cause a corresponding increase or decrease in the average price level. Given that the velocity of money and the volume of transactions are in reality never constant, it follows that this relationship is not as straightforward as it may initially seem. Nevertheless, this equation serves as an effective model of the monetarist belief that the expansion of the money supply is the principal cause of inflation. The bottom line. Inflation comes in many forms, from historically extreme cases of hyperinflation and stagflation to the 5-cent and 10-cent increases we hardly notice. Economists from the Keynesian and monetarist schools disagree on the root causes of inflation, underscoring the fact that inflation is a far more complex phenomenon than one might initially assume. Wage push inflation. Definition, causes, and examples. What is wage push inflation? Wage push inflation is an overall rise in the cost of goods and services that results from a rise in wages. To maintain corporate profits after an increase in wages, employers must increase the prices they charge for the goods and services they provide. The overall increased cost of goods and services has a circular effect on the wage increase. Eventually, as goods and services in the market overall increase, higher wages will be needed to compensate for the increased prices of consumer goods. Key takeaways. Wage push inflation is an overall rise in the cost of goods that results from a rise in wages. Employers must increase the prices they charge for the goods and services they provide after an increase in wages in order to maintain profits. The increase in wages and the resulting increase in prices create a circular effect on wages, as higher wages will be needed to compensate for the increased prices of goods and services. Understanding wage push inflation. Companies can increase wages for a number of reasons. The most common reason for raising wages is an increase in the minimum wage. The federal and state governments have the power to increase the minimum wage. Consumer goods companies are also known for making incremental wage increases for their workers. These minimum wage increases are a leading factor for wage push inflation. In consumer goods companies especially, wage push inflation is highly prevalent, and its effect is a function of the percentage increase in wages. Industry factors. Industry factors also play a part in driving wage increases. If a specific industry is growing rapidly, companies might raise wages to attract talent or provide higher compensation for their workers as an incentive to help business growth. All such factors have a wage push inflation effect on the goods and services the company provides. Economists track wages closely because of their wage push inflation effects. Wage push inflation has an inflationary spiral effect that occurs when wages are increased and businesses must, to pay the higher wages, charge more for their products and or services. Additionally, any wage increase that occurs will increase the money supply of consumers. With a higher money supply, consumers have more spending power, so the demand for goods increases. An increase in demand for goods then increases the price of goods in the broader market. Companies charge more for their goods to pay higher wages, and the higher wages also increase the price of goods in the broader market. As the cost of goods and services rises at the companies paying higher wages and in the broader market overall, the wage increase is not as helpful to employees since the cost of goods in the market has also risen. If prices remain increased, workers eventually require another wage increase to compensate for the cost of living increase. The percentage increase of the wages and prices and their overall effect on the market are key factors driving inflation in the economy. Example of wage push inflation. If a state raises the minimum wage from $5 to $20, then a company must pay its employees $20. However, now its cost of producing its goods and services has gone up because its cost of labor is now more expensive. To compensate for the increase in costs, the company must increase the prices of its products on the market. But because the goods and services become more expensive, the initial $15 raise in wages isn't enough to propel a consumer's purchasing power, and the wage must be raised again, therefore causing an inflationary spiral. Why do wage increases cause inflation? Wage increases cause inflation because the cost of producing goods and services goes up as companies pay their employees more. To make up for the increase in cost, companies must charge more for their goods and services to maintain the same level of profitability. The increase in the prices of goods and services is an inflation. What is an inflation target? Governments typically set an inflation target, which in the U.S. is approximately 2 a year. 1. An inflation target allows businesses and individuals to budget for the future. It provides an indicator for companies on how much to pay their employees and how much to charge for their goods and services. It indicates to individuals how much they can expect in wages as well as how much goods and services will cost. How does inflation impact the value of money? Inflation reduces the value of current money in the future. Because prices go up, the value of a dollar today is worth less than it is in the future. The same dollar today will be able to buy fewer goods and services in the future. Money is always worth more now than it is in the future, particularly due to the investment capability of money. Cost push inflation. When it occurs, definition and causes. What is cost push inflation? Cost push inflation, also known as wage push inflation, occurs when overall prices increase, inflation, Due to increases in the cost of wages and raw materials, higher costs of production can decrease the aggregate supply, the amount of total production in the economy. Since the demand for goods hasn't changed, the price increases from production are passed on to consumers, creating cost. Push inflation. Cost. Push inflation can be compared with demand. Pull inflation. Key takeaways. Cost. Push inflation occurs when overall prices increase. Inflation, due to increases in the cost of wages and raw materials. Cost. Push inflation can occur when higher costs of production decrease the aggregate supply, the amount of total production, in the economy. Since the demand for goods hasn't changed, the price increases from production are passed on to consumers, creating cost. Push inflation. Cost. Push inflation. Understanding cost. Push inflation. Inflation is a measure of the rate of price increases in an economy for a basket of selected goods and services. Inflation can erode a consumer's purchasing power if wages haven't increased enough or kept up with rising prices. If a company's production costs rise, the company's executive management might try to pass the additional costs onto consumers by raising the prices for their products. If the company doesn't raise prices while production costs increase, the company's profits will decrease. The most common cause of cost. Push inflation starts with an increase in the cost of production, which may be expected or unexpected. For example, the cost of raw materials or inventory used in production might increase, leading to higher costs. For cost, push inflation to take place, demand for the affected product must remain constant during the time the production cost changes are occurring. To compensate for the increased cost of production, producers raise the price to the consumer to maintain profit levels while keeping pace with expected demand. Causes of cost push inflation. As stated earlier, an increase in the cost of input goods used in manufacturing, such as raw materials. For example, if companies use copper in the manufacturing process and the price of the metal suddenly rises, companies might pass those increased costs on to their customers. Increased labor costs can create cost. Push inflation, such as when mandatory wage increases for production employees due to an increase in the minimum wage per worker. A worker strike due to stalled contract negotiations might also lead to a decline in production, and as a result, lead to higher prices. Unexpected causes of cost push inflation are often natural disasters, which can include floods, earthquakes, fires, or tornadoes. If a large disaster causes unexpected damage to a production facility and results in a shutdown or partial disruption of the production chain, higher production costs are likely to follow. A company might have no choice but to increase prices to help recoup some of the losses from a disaster. Although not all natural disasters result in higher production costs and therefore wouldn't lead to cost. Push inflation. Other events might qualify if they lead to higher production costs, such as a sudden change in government that affects the country's ability to maintain its previous output. However, government-induced increases in production costs are more often seen in developing nations. Government regulations and changes in current laws, although usually anticipated, may cause costs to rise for businesses because they have no way to compensate for the increased costs associated with them. For example, the government might mandate that healthcare be provided, driving up the cost of employees or labor. Cost push fees. Demand pull. Rising prices caused by consumers wanting more goods is called demand pull inflation. Demand pull inflation includes times when an increase in demand is so great that production can't keep up, which typically results in higher prices. In short, cost push inflation is driven by supply costs while demand pull inflation is driven by consumer demand, while both lead to higher prices passed on to consumers. Example of cost push inflation. The Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, is a cartel that consists of 13 member countries that both produce and export oil. In the early 1970s, due to geopolitical events, OPEC imposed an oil embargo on the United States and other countries. OPEC banned oil exports to targeted countries and also imposed oil production cuts. What followed was a supply shock and a quadrupling of the price of oil from approximately $3 to $12 per barrel. 2. Cost push inflation ensued since there was no increase in demand for the commodity. The impact of the supply cut led to a surge in gas prices as well as higher production costs for companies that used petroleum products. What causes inflation? Inflation, or a general rise in prices, is thought to occur for several reasons, and the exact reasons are still debated by economists. Monetarist theories suggest that the money supply is the root of inflation, where more money in an economy leads to higher prices. Cost-push inflation theorizes that as costs to producers increase from things like rising wages, these higher costs are passed on to consumers. Demand-pull inflation takes the position that prices rise when aggregate demand exceeds the supply of available goods for sustained periods of time. Is inflation always bad? In theory, a low amount of inflation can be a healthy sign of a growing economy. High inflation, however, can be damaging, but deflation or declining prices can be too. Note that inflation isn't always bad for certain groups of people. For example, borrowers at fixed interest rates tend to benefit from inflation, while lenders and savers are hurt by it. What is the wage-price spiral? The wage-price spiral is a take on cost. Push inflation argues that as wages rise, it creates more demand, which leads to higher prices. These higher prices thus incentivize workers to demand even higher wages, and so the cycle repeats. Cost-push inflation vs. Demand-pull inflation. What's the difference? Cost-push inflation vs. Demand-pull inflation. An overview. There are four main drivers behind inflation. Among them are cost-push inflation, or the decrease in the aggregate supply of goods and services stemming from an increase in the cost of production and demand. Pull inflation, or the increase in aggregate demand, categorized by the four sections of the macroeconomy: households, business, governments, and foreign buyers. The two other contributing factors to inflation include an increase in the money supply of an economy and a decrease in the demand for money. Inflation is the rate at which the general price level of goods and services rises. This, in turn, causes a drop in purchasing power. This is not to be confused with the change in the prices of individual goods and services, which rise and fall all the time. Inflation happens when prices rise across the economy to a certain degree. Key takeaways. Cost-push inflation is the decrease in the aggregate supply of goods and services stemming from an increase in the cost of production. Demand-pull inflation is the increase in aggregate demand, categorized by the four sections of the macroeconomy: households, business, governments, and foreign buyers. An increase in the costs of raw materials or labor can contribute to cost-pull inflation. Demand-pull inflation can be caused by an expanding economy, increased government spending, or overseas growth. How can inflation be good for the economy? Cost-push inflation. Aggregate supply is the total volume of goods and services produced by an economy at a given price level. When the aggregate supply of goods and services decreases because of an increase in production costs, it results in cost-push inflation. Cost-push inflation means prices have been pushed up by increases in the costs of any of the four factors of production: labor, capital, land, or entrepreneurship. When companies are already running at full production capacity, companies cannot maintain profit margins by producing the same amounts of goods and services when their costs are higher and their productivity is maximized. 1. The price of raw materials may also cause an increase in costs. This may occur because of a scarcity of raw materials, an increase in the cost of labor to produce the raw materials, or an increase in the cost of importing raw materials. The government may also increase taxes to cover higher fuel and energy costs, forcing companies to allocate more resources to paying taxes. 2. In order to compensate, the increase in costs is passed on to consumers, causing a rise in the general price level. Inflation. For cost-push inflation to occur, demand for goods must be static or inelastic. That means demand must remain constant while the supply of goods and services decreases. One example of cost-push inflation is the oil crisis of the 1970s. The price of oil was increased by OPEC countries, while demand for the commodity remained the same. As the price continued to rise, the costs of finished goods also increased, resulting in inflation. 3. Let's take a look at how cost-push inflation works using this simple price quantity graph. The graph below shows the level of output that can be achieved at each price level. As production costs increase, aggregate supply decreases from AS1 to AS2. Given production is at full capacity, causing an increase in the price level from PON to 2. The rationale behind this increase is for companies to maintain or increase profit margins. They will need to raise the retail price paid by consumers, thereby causing inflation. Cost push. Image by Julie Bang C. Investopedia 2019. Demand. Pull inflation. Demand. Pull inflation occurs when there's an increase in aggregate demand categorized by the four sections of the macroeconomy: households, businesses, governments, and foreign buyers. 4. When concurrent demand for output exceeds what the economy can produce. The four sectors compete to purchase a limited amount of goods and services. That means the buyers bid prices up again and cause inflation. This excessive demand, also referred to as too much money chasing too few goods, usually occurs in an expanding economy. 4. In Keynesian economics, an increase in aggregate demand is caused by a rise in employment, as companies need to hire more people to increase their output. 5. The increase in aggregate demand that causes demand. Pull inflation can be the result of various economic dynamics. For example, an increase in government spending can increase aggregate demand, thus raising prices. 5. Another factor can be the depreciation of local exchange rates, which raises the price of imports and, for foreigners, reduces the price of exports. As a result, the purchasing of imports decreases while the buying of exports by foreigners increases. This raises the overall level of aggregate demand, assuming aggregate supply cannot keep up with aggregate demand as a result of full employment in the economy. 6. Rapid overseas growth can also ignite an increase in demand as more exports are consumed by foreigners. Finally, if a government reduces taxes, households are left with more disposable income in their pocket. This, in turn, leads to an increase in consumer confidence that spurs consumer spending. 7. Looking again at the price quantity graph, we can see the relationship between aggregate supply and demand. If aggregate demand increases from A1 to A2 in the short run, this will not change aggregate supply. Instead, it will cause a change in the quantity supplied, represented by a movement along the S curve. The rationale behind this lack of shift in aggregate supply is that aggregate demand tends to react faster to changes in economic conditions than aggregate supply. As companies respond to higher demand with an increase in production, the cost to produce each additional output increases, as represented by the change from phone to 2. That's because companies would need to pay workers more money, AGEA overtime, and or invest in additional equipment to keep up with demand. Just like cost, push inflation demand. Pull inflation can occur as companies pass on the higher cost of production to consumers to maintain their profit levels. Demand pull. Image by Julie Bang C. Investopedia 2019. Special considerations. There are ways to counter both cost, push inflation, and demand. Pull inflation, which is through the implementation of different policies. To counter cost, push inflation supply. Side policies need to be enacted with the goal of increasing aggregate supply. 7. To increase aggregate supply, taxes can be decreased and central banks can implement contractionary monetary policies achieved by increasing interest rates. 8. Countering demand. Pull inflation would be achieved by the government and central bank implementing contractionary monetary and fiscal policies. This would include increasing the interest rate, the same as countering cost. Push inflation because it results in a decrease in demand, decreasing government spending, and increasing taxes, all measures that would reduce demand. Inflation vs. Stagflation. What's the difference? By Tony Del Torrio, updated June 2, 2022. Reviewed by Erica Razier. Inflation vs. Stagflation. Inflation is the broad rise in the price of goods and services across the economy. The Federal Reserve deems annual inflation, averaging 2 over the long run, most consistent with its mandates of stable prices and maximum employment, because that keeps the much more dangerous deflation at bay while supporting economic growth. 1. Still, inflation causes a currency to lose purchasing power. For example, if inflation is at 5 and you currently spend $100 per week on food, the following year you would need to spend $105 for the same groceries. Typically, inflation goes hand in hand with economic growth, and an overheated economy is one possible cause of higher inflation. Conversely, recessions typically cause inflation to slow. The relationship is intuitive. In an economy running hot by operating above its long-term potential, Price increases are necessary to ration labor and other scarce inputs and to offset those increased production costs. Meanwhile, a contracting economy with lots of spare capacity restrains price hikes and wage increases as demand slows. Stagflation is a term used to describe a stagnant economy hampered not only by slow growth but by high inflation as well. 2. While this combination may seem counterintuitive, it proved real during the 1970s and early 1980s when workers in the US and Europe were subjected to high unemployment as well as the loss of purchasing power. The causes of stagflation during that period remain in dispute, as did the likelihood of a reprise in 2022 amid high energy and food prices, rising interest rates, and persistent supply chain snags. Key takeaways. Inflation is the rate of increase in the overall price level of goods and services in an economy. Stagflation describes a combination of high inflation and economic stagnation, as reflected by a slow growth rate and high unemployment. The stagflation of the 1970s marked the U.S. economy's worst performance since the Great Depression. The causes of stagflation remain contentious, with some blaming loose fiscal and monetary policies and others austerity or oil price shocks. Inflation. As noted above, central banks like the Federal Reserve, often referred to as the Fed, and the European Central Bank ECB, prefer modest inflation to none at all, as insurance against destabilizing deflation. Policymakers aim for inflation of 2 to grease the wheels of commerce. They also seek to understand what's causing inflation, because inflationary impulses come in several distinct types, each with its own cause and consequences. 3 key varieties are demand, pull inflation, cost, push inflation, and wage. Price spiral inflation, the latter also known as built-in inflation. Demand. Pull inflation happens when demand for goods and services rises above the economy's capacity to meet it. The law of supply and demand suggests demand will moderate in that case, only in response to higher prices. 3. Demand. Pull inflation can result from loose fiscal and monetary policies or from inadequate investment. In all those cases, monetary and fiscal tightening is the likely outcome, since investments in increasing the economy's productive capacity often take a long time to produce results. Cost. Push inflation reflects a rise in prices of one or more key economic inputs, such as crude oil, grain, or labor. 4. Cost. Push inflation results when producers are able to recoup their increased costs by increasing the price of finished products. If input costs rise as a result of a temporary disruption in supply such as factory closings caused by a pandemic, for example, policymakers may reasonably assume the price pressures will prove temporary as well. Cost. Push inflation occurred in 2005 after Hurricane Katrina destroyed gasoline supply lines in the region. The demand for gas did not change, but the lack of supply raised the price of gasoline to $5 a gallon. 5. 6. The wage price spiral, sometimes also called wage push inflation or built-in inflation, describes instances when rising wages and prices reinforce each other, with higher prices driving wage increases, which then result in still higher prices. The wage price spiral is what can happen when policymakers fail to bring inflation under control. 7. 8. A wage price spiral seemed improbable for decades after Paul Volcker's Fed tamed inflation in the early 1980s, bringing stagflation to an end. In the aftermath of the 2007 to 2008 Great Recession and financial crisis and until 2021, inflation mostly fell short of the Fed's targets amid lackluster economic growth. 9. Inflation is a singular phenomenon that can have multiple causes, and many inflationary episodes don't fit neatly into one of the categories above. For example, the increase in inflation in 2021 and 2022 reflected the demand pull effect of the fiscal stimulus and pandemic relief legislation, as well as the cost push of supply chain disruptions, including sharply higher shipping costs. 10. 11. The inflation of the 1970s has been variously attributed to the cost push of oil price shocks and the demand pull of relaxed fiscal and monetary policies. 12. Stagflation. The debate about what caused stagflation in the 1970s features a similar list of prime suspects, from soaring energy prices to the end of managed exchange rates following the collapse of the Bretton Woods system. Accounts blaming the toxic combination of weak growth and high inflation on policymakers' insufficient fiscal and monetary discipline have been countered by others highlighting the effects of fiscal austerity and the abandonment of administrative and informal price and wage restraint. 14. What's indisputable is that it took a pair of painful recessions to bring down inflation for good and legislation enacting larger U.S. budget deficits and economic deregulation to revive growth during Ronald Reagan's presidency. Stagflation marked the worst performance by advanced economies between the Great Depression and the Great Recession, and as such left a lasting mark. It led economist Arthur Ocon to come up with a misery index summing the inflation and unemployment rates, and the name encapsulates how that period of economic history is remembered. One obstacle in the way of a stagflationary rerun is the modern global economy's significantly reduced dependence on energy to generate growth. Others include the historically large budget deficit, interest rate increases by the Federal Reserve, and modest inflation expectations shaped by decades of low inflation. 16. The old argument about whether inflation stems from too little regulation or too much has returned in a new guise, as a debate about whether companies' increased market concentration has allowed them to raise prices, contributing to recent inflation. 18. The bottom line. The only difference between inflation and stagflation is economic growth. Typically, inflation is coupled with economic growth and can even be a byproduct of a rapidly expanding economy. Conversely, recessions usually slow inflation. Stagflation refers to the rare and puzzling phenomenon of a recession coinciding with prolonged high inflation. Economic conditions in early 2022 led many commentators to wonder whether the U.S. was headed for a return to stagflation. However, most analysts believe the country's reduced reliance on imported oil and energy in general, plus the Federal Reserve's credibility, should stave off 1970s-style stagflation. Why is stagflation so unpopular? The combination of slow growth and inflation is unusual because inflation typically rises and falls with the pace of growth. The high inflation leaves less scope for policymakers to address growth shortfalls with lower interest rates and higher public spending. What is the misery index? The misery index is the sum of the unemployment and inflation rates. It was popularized in the 1970s as a rough measure of the economic distress amid stagflation. What is purchasing power? Purchasing power measures the value of a currency in terms of the goods and services a unit of that currency can buy. 19. Inflation decreases the number of goods or services you can purchase for a set amount of money, lowering purchasing power